Hello everybody. You're probably not too surprised to hear, but Isaac has ruined my life. Okay, maybe that's a little bit extreme, but yeah, I should have seen this coming. You see, I've obviously been aware of this game for a very long time. I used to watch it religiously back when Rebirth first came out, when I first heard about the game. However, for years now, I've actually avoided buying it on purpose. Because I knew the second I got this game, it would consume me. And I was actually a little scared of just how much it might consume me. And for years, I dodged it and said, no, I won't do this to myself. But it had been so long that I finally thought to myself, you know what? It can't be that bad. Especially now I'm into Overwatch so much, and that's kind of the closest thing I have to a main game. I kind of found it hard to imagine Isaac having the time to even consume my life. It's already been eaten by Overwatch. However, clearly that was hubris, because yes, I am overall pretty ashamed to admit that I have only owned this game for a month, and I am about 55% of the way to Dead God already, which is probably not a good thing. That being said, yeah, obviously it clicked. Actually, surprisingly enough, for the first week I had it, I didn't really play it that much. Not that I disliked it, but you know, I was playing it the amount a normal human being probably should. It was only after like the 1 week mark that something just clicked and went seriously wrong. So yeah, that's why things have been a bit quiet here. My mind has just been a melting pot of Isaac. And while usually, whenever I get a new hyperfixation, I'll be immediately on making videos about it, Isaac is just such a huge, ridiculously ginormous game that, like, I really didn't want to start making videos yapping about things I hardly understood. Like, sure, I followed the game religiously before now, I already knew a lot about the game going into it, but I knew a lot about Vanilla Rebirth. My god, there has been so much added since then. I still truly did not understand how huge Repentance was. I already saw a decent amount of anti-birth, so I thought I knew what to expect going into Repentance Plus, but holy Christ! I could never have seen the amount of content this game has gotten since coming. With all that said, the main topic of this video is going to be a little talk about the game's main character, Isaac. Because I'm thinking I'm going to go one at a time covering the cast in depth and what I think about each character. And to be clear, no, I'm not going to be talking about their tainted versions in these videos. I have unlocked most of the tainted characters by now, but I also only have a decent amount of experience with a couple of them, and most of them I've only played a couple matches and probably couldn't really give you very much of an informed opinion on them. So, if I'm dedicated enough, the tainted characters will come down the line when I have much more solid opinions on them. For now, we're just talking vanilla Isaac. And just before we dive into it, I'd like to make clear for anyone not familiar with this game, I'm not really going to be explaining it. I know because I jump between games a lot, I usually go in depth explaining the games that I'm jumping to, but the thing is, if you didn't already know, which most of you do, this is Isaac. It is already one of the most well-known indie games out there, and greatly beloved. I really doubt that many of you watching haven't at least heard or at least don't know a little bit about it. And if you don't, there is so much to get through that would be an hours-long video in its own right. So this will be one of the few times I just want to say, if you don't know what's going on in this video game, you might want to go watch someone else just to get an idea first. Because there is just too much ground to cover, and I think most people already know about Isaac anyway. With all that said, let's stop talking about Isaac the game, and let's talk about Isaac the man. Or child, I suppose. We're not talking about Isaac after taking 3 puberty pills, my bad. Despite being the game's starter character, Isaac is actually really good. Well, maybe not at first, actually. You see, usually I would wait until we properly introduced the basics of a character before immediately diving into their unlockable starting items. However, in Isaac's case specifically, the iconic D6 is not only his only unlockable starting item, but also kind of the most powerful thing he has access to that basically defines his entire identity more than anything else. As a result, I feel like I kind of have to do a strange start and go straight to talking about the D6. An active item with a 6-room long recharge and a monumentally simple but powerful effect. The ability to re-roll item pedestals in the room into new items belonging to the current room's item pool. Trust me, if you haven't played Isaac before, or have only watched, or maybe if you only dipped your toe in and played a couple hours, you do not understand how good this ability is. Beyond the obvious consistency boost in a game that is already aggressively random where that presents the main challenge, you can also abuse this to turn worthless items into absolute gold if you know what you're doing. And even just getting 1 or 2 effectively bonus items from turning what would otherwise be literally useless items into amazing items, even just 1 or 2 of those over the course of your run, that has monumental impact. That is game winning. Let alone what happens to you when you start to learn how to pull stunts like this multiple times a floor. Got a useless active item that you want to dump because you're not leaving behind your D6? Drop it on a pedestal and roll it into something worthwhile. Fighting an archangel from an angel deal or sacrifice room? Well, guess what? You can just re-roll the useless key piece that it drops into a god tier bonus angel deal item to lock in the W for your run, nice and easy. Don't think that judgment card you picked up is going to be worthwhile, because all it's going to do is spawn a worthless beggar that takes all your money in return for some garbage fly item. Just spawn them, alongside any other trash item drops like slot machines or blood banks, in the secret room, and then roll them into game-winning items like R keys, death certs, and magic mushrooms. The D6 is a monster of an item that, despite its understated appearance, genuinely propels Isaac to being among the top 3 strongest characters in the entire game for me, at least from what I've played so far. All that to say though, Christ, does that make it hard as hell to swallow just playing base Isaac without the D6 on a fresh save file. PSA, if you are going to start a new save file in Isaac, please, for the love of God, play as few games with the original Isaac as possible until you get the D6. Without it, Isaac is, yeah, pretty bad. Unfortunately, getting the D6 isn't particularly quick or particularly easy though. The D6 is unlocked by beating Isaac, the boss, not the man, the child, the video game, the Bible guy. Beating Isaac the boss with the game's very first original secret challenge character. Question mark, question mark, question mark. More commonly referred to by the community as Blue Baby. Now that alone is already actually a little difficult to pull off for a newer player. Not only is Blue Baby a character that was intentionally designed to be weaker and tougher to play than most of the rest of the cast, but on top of that, getting to the cathedral to fight Isaac can actually genuinely be quite difficult early on. If you haven't unlocked the Polaroid yet by beating Isaac 5 times to guarantee access to the cathedral, then you're going to have to pray to get an angel deal on Womb 2 to get there. So you basically got to no-hit Womb 2 in most cases, and also no-hit the Mom's Heart fight, and after all that, you still have to pray you actually hit the RNG that the angel deal door appears in the first place. And doing all that can really be surprisingly tough, especially when you still have one more challenging floor to tackle afterwards, all just to get to the actual Isaac fight, which you then actually, have to beat. Then take into account you also need to unlock Blue Baby in the first place, which in itself requires you to kill Mom's Heart 10 times, which takes a lot longer than you might think, and you will find that there really aren't many shortcuts to a quick D6, unfortunately. Like I said earlier, this really is not how I plan for most of these character breakdown videos to go, but it's just like I said, the D6 is so important to Isaac that to me it just feels like outlining the new player ordeal of getting it feels very relevant to the point of explaining what it's like to play this character. I would also like to make these videos a bit of an excuse to give suggestions about what could possibly improve each character, even the ones I love and consider near perfect. And I'm bringing this up because Isaac with the D6 might actually be perfect in my eyes. Easy to pick up, hard to master, fun to play, easily adaptable to different playstyles and strategy. Absolute gaming cinema. But then all that leaves me with only one real area of complaint, and that of course is the pre-D6 Isaac. Don't get me wrong, I see the value in not throwing in an item as deceptively complicated to use as the D6 right at a new player's face, and actually like that your first game on every file will be plain Isaac with no D6. I just think the period of time where Isaac is expected to make do with practically nothing lasts far too long, and could use a stepping stone or two to bridge the gap. That is my one issue with Vanilla Isaac. Before I can talk to you about what you could do about that, let's talk about what I would probably choose to open with when talking about almost any other character than Isaac, that being their basic stats. Isaac is often referred to as the all-rounder with average base stats in all categories, which is kind of true, but maybe just a little misleading, I think. While it is true that nearly every other character in the game pretty obviously uses Isaac's base stats as a template to copy and paste, slightly tweaking them to make their own stats, that doesn't necessarily mean that Isaac is average at everything. I would say that Isaac's damage is underwhelming compared to most of the competition, not only because there are other characters whose DPS stats are more impressive, but also because many characters that technically copy Isaac's DPS stats in practice end up having more DPS than the numbers would lead you to believe, due to their special gimmicks. Meanwhile, Isaac has no such tricks up his sleeves, just the low damage, underwhelming base stats with no Babylon, no Bloody Lust, no Book of Belial, and no Box of Friends. However, the upshot of this underwhelming damage is that Isaac's starting HP is actually pretty remarkably high. 3 hearts might sound pretty normal from the outside, but in practice that's actually a health bar that is only bested in size by Maggie, who is literally intended to be the health character. Most characters either get 2 hearts to start, or perhaps technically get 3, but more than half of those 3 hearts are spirit hearts or black hearts that can't regenerate. Isaac, on the other hand, gets access to a large and healthy replenishable health pool right off the bat that can make him much more forgiving to approach for newer players. And in fact, I'd say it's the only thing he really has going for him without the D6. Putting all that into numbers though, we get this. A speed of 1, obviously, a tier rate of 2.73, a damage number of 3.5, a range of 6.5, a shot speed of 1, and a luck of 0. Like I say, these are the base stats, and so every other character in the game will copy these stats and just tweak them a little bit to get their numbers. As well as all that, in my initial recording, I completely forgot about something else to do with Isaac's starting stats. Only this isn't necessarily a damage or a speed stat, this is a consumable. Isaac starts with a bomb. It's really easy to forget that, like I did, but you probably shouldn't make the same mistake I did and try and keep that one in mind. It's pretty easy to forget, especially because there are actually very few characters in the game that actually have any starting resources. If I'm not mistaken, it's only Isaac starting with a bomb, Cain starting with a key, and Judas starting with 3 coins, and that's it. Only 3 out of the game's 17 non-tainted characters have something like this, and of course it's 3 of the most vanilla characters in the game, so it can be easy to forget they even have this feature. Now obviously all of these have their uses, but out of the 3, I would say that Isaac probably got the better end of the deal. Listen, typically I'm more excited to find money than bombs in Isaac, but I also have to give credit where it's due. Bombs are probably the most versatile resource in Isaac out of those 3. And that means out of these 3 things, it's probably most worthwhile to get a free bomb to start. Mostly because, if you didn't already realize, explosions interact with so many different things in the games in so many different ways that bombs can be used in lots of unconventional situations, not just to buy things or to unlock doors. Money and keys both have the problem of often finding situations where if the thing you're supposed to use the coins or the keys on doesn't spawn, then you can't do anything with them. Whereas bombs, there's always something you can do with them. It's just about figuring out what is the best thing to do with them. The obvious thing that most people use their bombs for is finding secret rooms and tinted rocks. Most people also know that if you're desperate for cash and you'd rather have money, you can always just use a bomb to blow up your donation machine and cash out big time as a result. But hey, even if you don't want to blow up your donation machine or it doesn't spawn, you still have the option to, if you're desperate for just 1 or 2 more cents before you leave the floor so you can buy that item in the shop, you can always just blow up some pots. Sure, they don't give a whole lot of money and the chances aren't guaranteed, but they will typically drop money if you blow up enough of them. And if you really do just need those 1 or 2 extra cents to get that item on floor 1, then obviously you're gonna do it. Whenever you feel like it's appropriate to go for a real Hail Mary, you can even go blowing up pots looking for a quarter to spawn. Or, once again, if you've got way more buns than you need and you're pretty desperate for an item right now, you could always go blowing up a bunch of rocks looking for a random crawl space for a free item. If you find a 1-block gap with a destructible near it, you can always blow it up to turn it into a bridge to get across the gap and get what's on the other side. One little technique I like to pull a lot is when I find items that are surrounded by spikes that I do not think are worth paying health for. If I have excess bombs, I usually throw a bomb in there and use the explosion to bait the items out from behind the spikes so I don't have to get hurt to grab the item. You can blow up corpses that you find in the secret room or shop to get potentially money, but also guaranteed deal chance. And lastly, and in fairness most ridiculously, but genuinely this has saved my life every now and then, If you find yourself in the unusual situation of needing to deal damage to yourself but not having any spikes, curse rooms, or fires around to do it, the only way you can do it a lot of times will be to blow yourself up. I know this one probably sounds particularly ridiculous, and I'm not saying it's common, but there have been moments where I would have lost big time on resources if I wasn't able to blow myself up to proc my self-damaging mechanics. And that's all without even mentioning the kind of obvious but easy to forget use of, you can use bombs in combat, like that's allowed. They deal 100 damage, which is already a ridiculous amount. Again, your tiers do 3.5. That is a ridiculous damage increase compared to normal shooting. But even better than that, bombs are also completely armor piercing. There are a lot of bigger enemies and definitely a lot of bosses that have a hidden armor mechanic that can make your damage much less significant, and bombs completely ignore it, meaning in the early game, most bosses can be 1 or at least 2 shot by bombs. Especially in particularly brutal challenge runs or situations where speed is super important, that is actually pretty useful. Yes, I am kind of just turning this into a ramble generally about why bombs are really good, I obviously confess. But to bring it back to Isaac, the reason why one free bomb is so good, at least in the right context, is that when you are on a run where the danger is dying early, where you really want to min-max your first floor, the fact that you have so many options of how to use your one free bomb if the game does kind of screw you and not give you any bombs, means that an experienced player is far more likely to be able to find something to interact with that can wring just a little bit of value out of the floor before you have to leave it. And this of course is a relatively snowbally game. So don't get me wrong, it might seem like it's not all that significant to wring 2 extra cents out of your floor 1, but depending on the shops you see, and depending on your luck, you might find that those 2 cents that you earned by using your bombs smartly was quite literally the game-winning play. All that being said, I will also confess this is coming from the mouth of a dirty min-maxer. My current favourite memory in this game is spending literally 2 hours on a single floor as Tainted Maggie, doing an infinite item game break so that I could get an R-key, only to then accidentally go to the one boss in the game you can't R-key and not realise until it was too late. But still, I was happy about the journey. It's about the journey. I did the 3-hour-long run with the 2-hour-long game break. That's all that matters. So yeah, either way, don't get me wrong, more runs than not, you're probably not going to notice that Isaac even gets a free bomb to start. But I'm just saying, the runs where you notice that free bomb, if you're really paying attention and really getting the maximum value you can out of your bombs, you're going to notice it, and you will be like, I am so glad I had that. As for Isaac's unlocks, I'd describe them as a mixed bag, but a mixed bag leaning towards good. For those of you who are unaware, while I'm expecting everyone watching this video is aware of Isaac, I'm also expecting that a decent amount of you will have only watched it. So for those of you who haven't played the game yourself, you can end a game of Isaac in multiple ways, and what's important for completion is beating certain bosses, which give you completion marks on the post-it note for your character. Every single one of these marks will give you some sort of completion reward and unlock something in the game. And so when you're actually playing the game yourself and going for 100% or a Dead God save file as it's called, you're going to be looking to fill out each of these post-it notes and get all these completion rewards. Now, because I don't want this video to get too long and get too derailed, I'm not going to get into detailed explanations of what each of the items Isaac unlocks does, but I will take care to point out important ones. So, starting with one of Isaac's weakest unlocks, for beating Boss Rush, you will unlock the Isaac's Head trinket. This is actually pretty strong in the early game, but scales pretty poorly, and so most people consider it to be a bad trinket on average. For getting the easiest completion mark of just beating Mom's heart, you unfortunately only unlock a baby for co-op mode. I've never even played co-op, so I don't know what these do, but from what I've heard, they're practically useless and no one cares about them. So yeah, whenever you see a co-op baby unlock, it's always a little disappointing. However, if you beat Satan by going to Sheol, you will unlock Mom's Knife, which is literally one of the most iconic, overpowered items in the game. It is like the classic, if you get this item, you've won the run. So, obviously it's a priority. For beating the Lamb, you'll get the Missing Poster, a trinket that isn't that powerful, but is required to be used to unlock a certain secret character, so it is a pretty important unlock. For beating Isaac as Isaac, you'll get Isaac's Tears, which is a fun and quirky but not particularly strong item. For beating Blue Baby, you'll get access to the D20, a pretty good item, but one that also tends to take quite a bit of knowledge to get the most value out of. For beating greed mode, you get a little chest, which is okay. Same for greedier mode, you get the D1, which is also pretty decent. For beating the Hush, you get Fart Baby. Once again, pretty decent item, but not exactly blowing you away. For beating Mega Satan, you unfortunately just get another co-op baby. For beating Delirium though, you do get the D-Infinity, one of the best items in the entire game. For beating Mother, you get the Cleaver, which is a bit niche, but it's definitely a fun item and not always bad. And for beating the Beast, you get Options, ? An item that some people have pretty polarized opinions of because it can be quite frustrating to use for some, but one that's generally considered to be pretty good. So just to put this in plain terms, when I said earlier you should probably play base Isaac as little as possible, the only thing I recommend doing with base Isaac is obviously, first of all, you have to start with base Isaac because you don't have anyone else unlocked when you start a new file. But once you have all the characters unlocked, the only thing I think you should go do with base Isaac is go get Mom's Knife and maybe the missing poster for defeating the Lamb. After that, the only thing that really is a must-have in Isaac's unlock repertoire is probably the D-Infinity for beating Delirium. But that's not to say there's not a lot of good stuff here, which while it's not necessarily a must-have, is still very nice to have. Probably the most notable of those items being the D20 for beating Blue Baby. Well, with all that said, how do we improve on this now? Like I said, there's not much to improve actually. Isaac is genuinely really good. The biggest thing to be worked on easing is the gap between base Isaac and D6 Isaac. But I suppose there is one other issue we could talk about. You see, Isaac isn't really the only culprit here, but the base tier rate and damage in this game is awful, to be frank, to the point of genuinely being quite boring and sometimes even infuriating to play with. The tough part of this though is it's much easier to see this as a problem with the whole game than a problem with Isaac. But obviously I kind of want to keep this video to the scope of just problems with Isaac. You can cry skill issue all you want, but this isn't a matter of games too hard. I may be slightly embarrassed to admit how far I am through this game already, but the upshot is I get to take at least a little pride in it as a little treat, to prove skill requirement isn't really my issue with the game at the moment. It's a matter of game's not fun, at least not for the first 20 minutes, when I'm just chasing spiders and flies that are hiding from me, and more often than not will only ever get hits from boring me into making mistakes out of frustration, rather than actually presenting any kind of challenge. There are so many enemies in the early game of Isaac that feel designed to just rage bait you and nothing else. They will literally never hit me if I lock in, but I do not want to be locked in for 20 minutes of spider dodging gameplay. So I absolutely openly confess, my early game almost always looks very sloppy in this game, but it's usually more because I'm feeling bored and pissed by the game, and less so because I actually feel I can't beat it. Like, I know I'm derailing this video a little bit, but I feel like this is such an important part of how I feel about this whole game that, like, you need to know this about me before I can get into my opinions on most of the characters, especially because Isaac suffers from this in particular. Can we just take a moment to talk about how psychotic it is and how unresponsive it feels that tiny spiders at the start of the game that come in swarms, that move randomly, not only require multiple shots to kill, not just one. We're talking about enemies the size of your pinky finger that for some reason do not die in one shot. But on top of taking multiple hits to kill, these tiny spiders you could probably crush with your foot apparently are so jacked they don't even take knockback when you shoot them. I mean, Christ. I hate any tiny swarmy enemy in this game that doesn't die in one hit, so I hate flies and leeches too, but at least I'll defend them on the fact they at least give feedback. If you shoot them, they get knocked back. In fact, as annoying as they can be, I think leeches are probably the one I like the most out of these three, because it actually feels like you shoot them and something happens, they bounce backwards. But spiders, they just shrug it off. The only real justification for enemies to be like this in the early game, I suppose, is you could argue it emphasizes the importance of items, something new players do need to learn ASAP in fairness. And I think that sounds nice in theory, but it really falls apart in practice though. First up, plenty of items in Isaac are for value or utility only, rather than combat. And while I consider that to generally be a good thing for the game, it does also mean that getting an absolutely miserable first couple floors from getting too many utility or value items is pretty common and always a slog to deal with. Once again, difficulty is rarely ever even the concern here, boredom is. Second, this is infamously one of the most RNG heavy games of all time. Even if you manage to get combat items, they might just suck, and then you'll still have a miserable start anyway. There are items that technically help you in combat, but are just kinda bad, numerically speaking. But for third, let's say you do get a combat item and it is good in terms of damage output. Well, you might get an item that's technically a good combat item, but also one that's pretty heavily dependent on other synergies to make them consistently effective. And if you don't have the other synergy pieces, then you can still have a miserable time. So, finally, and worst of all, okay, let's say you've checked off all those boxes. You got a combat item, it is a decent combat item, and it isn't super dependent on other synergies to be effective. Well, finally, and worst of all, say you actually get all that, and you get a nice damage up, let's say. That is cool and all, and that will definitely help versus normal enemies and bosses. But the swarmy spiders and flies that I'm mostly complaining about in the early game still take 2 hits to kill, even with a meaty damage up off the bat. For some psychotic reason, almost every swarmy enemy at the beginning of the game has 6.5 health, when your starting damage is 3.5, and the best damage ups in the game usually don't give much more than 1.2 damage up. So it still takes 2 hits to kill spiders. Hell, you can get 2 damage ups and you're still probably going to be taking 2 hits to kill these stupid spiders. Why? In fairness, again, these damage ups are much more useful versus normal enemies that aren't designed like garbage. But like I say, these swarmy enemies are the main source of boredom and frustration at the beginning of the game. So they're kind of the main thing I'm hoping for a damage up to solve and get me through. Like I said, Isaac isn't the only culprit here, so part of me is tempted to say this isn't even an Isaac issue. I would really like to change some of the early game swarmy enemies in this game to one-hits instead, alongside maybe shrinking the health pools of just a few of the slightly tankier early game bosses, just a little. I think bosses in general are mostly good, but there are just some that are a little bit tedious to kill, not even difficult, they just take a long time if you get no tears or damage ups. That being said, because we want to keep the scope of this video relevant to Isaac, for now, let's just say that we do put the onus of this on Isaac. It's not really fair, but let's blame Isaac for this and say, how do we fix it? Well, there's an argument to be made this is why Isaac has the D6 to start. That if you don't get the early game you want, you can just re-roll. And if you're getting trash, it must be because you're using the D6 wrong. That helps somewhat, but I mean, you can always just re-roll effectively and still get trashed no matter how well you use it. It can always happen. Though in fairness, if we are keeping the scope smaller and not talking about the broader early game and just Isaac changes, just being able to re-roll is about the best we can do though. I mean, we could just give Isaac a straight up damage buff, but like, why? He's already one of the best characters in the game, and it's not like the issues he has in the early game isn't something also shared by like a third of the rest of the cast. So with those restrictions in mind, I think the best we can probably do is just continue to introduce improved granularity and consistency in the randomness. Even if we can never guarantee a fair result, at the very least it brings us closer to one. With all that in mind, I think I've cooked up a change that would kill 2 birds with 1 stone, acting both as a stepping stone unlock that makes Isaac more bearable without the D6, while also improving his consistency and chances for a decent start, especially once you have the D6 on top of this. And I confess, I'm feeling pretty happy with how this has turned out, and I'm hoping you will be on the same page as me here. Upon defeating Mom's Heart for the first time with Isaac, instead of just unlocking a useless co-op baby, you will instead unlock a starting trinket for Isaac called the Dice Shaker. The Dice Shaker adds a 15% chance to replace your room clear rewards with a dice shard, a one-time consumable that already exists in the game, which triggers both the D6 and D20 effects on use. The D20 effect being to reroll all pickups and consumables on the ground in that room. This 15% chance on this trinket should be left unaffected by luck, as I think consistent dice spawns could get way out of hand if those odds could ever be raised. Though luck could still be a little useful here, as luck does improve your chances of getting a room clear reward in the first place, which does indirectly buff the outcomes of this trinket just a little bit. As well as that, this Dice Shaker will have one more little gimmick. When dropped, this trinket immediately transforms into a dice shard. So, you have the option to cash this trinket out for 1 free reroll if you'd like to replace it. However, once you do, there's no going back. You can't go back to having that Dice Shaker, it's gone. With all that said, let's talk balance and design. A 15% chance might sound actually quite high for such a powerful consumable, but I think it's important to put this in perspective. The chance for a room clear reward to appear in the first place with the default 0 luck is 78%. If you do the maths, that shows on average you'd have to clear out 8.5 rooms to get 1 dice shard. Worthwhile for sure, of course, that's the point, but also not exactly crazy numbers when you account for the size of the average floor and the fact that not every room even had combat in it to warrant having a room clear reward in the first place. At the very beginning of the game, you're probably only getting 1 dice shard, and that is if you're lucky and you get a very big floor. If you have average luck, then on your average run, you're probably looking at about 1.1 dice shards per floor, maybe 1.2, I don't know. And I'm not saying that's not strong. Of course it's strong, but I think it's reasonable strong. You're not going to get an enormous number of dice shards over the course of the game, not without getting very lucky. It's also important to keep in mind that this is replacing your room clear reward, not being added to it. While in most cases it is true that a dice shard is going to be better than your normal room clear reward, it does mean less chests, less keys, less bombs, and less money. In the wrong context, this trinket can genuinely begin to be a detriment, and dropping it may start to look very appealing for the instant free reroll instead. As a result, I think this new trinket genuinely fixes a lot. First of all, the bonus rerolls improve consistency, and even open up new opportunities to min-max and game break with Isaac for the experienced players. The dice shard is hardly ever used for its D20 effect in normal games because the D6 is just more significant, but Isaac specifically already has a reusable D6, but not the D20. So the D20 half of the effect may get to see way more use on Isaac. Bonus rerolls also means a better chance of getting a good start to your run, which could help to make some of the earlier floors far less painful than they can be on this character. Second, maybe I'm gonna get a little carried away here, but I genuinely do think this really helps to teach players more advanced concepts about the game, which is very important considering this is going to be an early unlock for Isaac, you know, the main character. It not only teaches them the importance of clearing every room they can by rewarding them with bonus rerolls for clearing rooms, but it also teaches them that getting the most out of their items isn't always intuitive. The fact that you are both rewarded with a reroll for dropping the trinket, but also punished by not being able to recover it, is good for newer players. Usually the confusing nature of some trinkets, combined with how passive most of them are, leads to a lot of newer players, understandably, just picking things up without knowing what they do and assuming they're just going to get value for holding it. Introducing the idea of a trinket that can give value for getting rid of it not only directs them to consider how trinkets are best used more deeply than just picking one and holding it all game, but it also eventually leads them to consider the downsides of their effects once they learn them, because those can be used to justify whether it is worth it to drop it or not. And lastly, it'll also be funny seeing people accidentally picking up trinkets they didn't mean to, forcing them to drop their dice shaker and never get it back. I say that kind of jokingly because obviously that's a little bit evil and trolly, but once again, I genuinely think that having a punishing mechanic like that can actually be a good way to teach newer players to think about and pay attention to what they're picking up. I might agree that this would be far too harsh if losing the trinket was the kind of thing that's going to lose your run. But because this trinket, while effective, isn't necessarily the kind of thing where having it or not having it is super likely to end your run, I feel like it's just a light but reasonable punishment that they will lose their trinket, but I mean, they still get to play the game, and if they have unlocked the D6, they still have the D6. Lastly, and most importantly though in my eyes, is I think that this trinket just opens up new playstyles for Isaac for those who have experience already. Beyond the obvious new avenue I already mentioned of the D20 effect, the dice shaker also opens up the option for Isaac to drop his D6 if he sees an active item halfway through the run to replace it with. Isaac has technically always had that option, but in practice the D6 is just so strong it's rarely the right play ever, meaning a large chunk of the item pool is borderline unusable to Isaac because they take his precious D6 slot, and he can't get rid of his precious D6, it's the most broken item in the game. Okay, like, top 10 most broken item in the game. Listen, this game has a lot of items, that's still really impressive. This is a problem with a lot of older characters, not just Isaac, but I think it's the worst on Isaac by far, because at least for most of the older characters who do have active items that they usually want to hold on to, their starting active is usually good, but still not the best. A Yum Heart is good, but an Eden's Soul is better. A Book of Belial is very nice, but it's probably not beating an S-Bible. For the D6 though, there is very little you are willing to swap out for it, and that does mean that the active item slot just feels like a useless class of item to one of the game's most iconic and important characters, which just feels a little wrong to me. The fact that the Dice Shaker guarantees some level of rerollability even without your d6 opens Isaac up to drop his d6 in some runs for something else more often, without necessarily throwing the game because of it. Alternatively, if you're keeping your d6 but the rerolls are still a little too much for you, you always have the option to drop the Dice Shaker early to reroll aggressively for a good item to start your run, even if it costs you bonus dice shards down the line. One nice little bonus of adding this trinket is we could replace Isaac's last dumb co-op baby unlock for beating Mega Satan while we're at it. While Isaac unlocks this trinket as a starting item for beating Mom's heart, we could make it so to unlock it for everyone else as a normal trinket that can just drop on the ground, you have to beat Mega Satan as Isaac. It feels more fitting to get a real reward for beating the original super boss anyway. That's actually something I just have a genuine problem with a lot of unlocks in this game. I'm pretty sure every Mega Satan unlock, at least for the non-tainted characters, is literally just a co-op baby, and it's like, why? It's the original super boss. Why is the reward literal garbage? Genuinely though, this Dice Shaker trinket is all I really have to say about Isaac. Unless we're talking changes to the entire early game, which isn't really about Isaac anymore, this would be all I would do to change it. Because Isaac is already an amazing character as he is. It is genuinely hard to have an unfun run on Isaac. It should go without saying, but it is important to repeat that good game design is about giving players decisions. And Isaac just gives you so many decisions, even if it's all through just one item. It feels like there are always branching paths and you're never getting cornered or stuck in a dead end. And so that not only means that it feels like there's so much to discover, but of course also means that when you finally do fail, you don't really think, oh, what the hell, what was I supposed to do? You're much more likely to think, maybe I took the wrong path. There were so many paths that you didn't go down that maybe the reason you ended in failure is because you didn't understand the way you were going wasn't the way you wanted to be going. And again, while it's never nice to know that you failed, it is nice to know that there's something you can do about it, rather than simply see the game put you in a corner and then killed you for being in that corner, even though it never let you play in any other position. So yeah, overall, if I'm talking from a very clinical, sort of emotionally removed perspective and not just talking about my favourite characters, I think there's a pretty strong argument to say that Isaac is the single most well-designed character in this entire game. Don't get me wrong, is he my favourite? Close, I still really like Isaac, but there's probably a couple of characters I like a bit more. But even then, a lot of that is based on personal preference, and factors that are a bit more wishy-washy and a bit less objective. If we are talking cold and clinical objective assessments of the characters, I think I'd be pretty likely to call Isaac the best character in the game. With that being said, thank you for watching, and we'll see who I decide to cover in the next video. I mean, the obvious idea would be that I go Maggie, but I'll see if there's someone I'd like to cover first, or whether I'll just go in order. With all that said, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.